Hey everybody, what's good? You're listening to the Liberty Cast and I'm your host, Big E. On this week's episode, we'll do a little catch up since there was no show last week, obviously. We're going to look at the shooting in Santa Clarita Commiefornia and what we might have been able to do to prevent that. We'll also examine the conviction of Roger Stone and contrast that with another subject of a high profile case. We'll talk about Chick-fil-A and their bending the knee to the leftist rage mob. And we'll get into some impeachment drama as well. We'll get into all of that and more on this week's episode of the Liberty Cast. So, as I said in the opening, there was no show last week, and there was a reason. A little more than a week ago, we had to say goodbye to our beloved black lab, Jax. And it was incredibly difficult. I started to prepare a show, but decided that I just really was not into it. And rather than stumble through a subpar show, I decided just not to do one. Now, if you've ever had to say goodbye to a pet, then you know how tough that is. And if you haven't had to deal with that, on one hand, you're fortunate, but on the other hand, you haven't had the companionship and love that an animal like that can bring to your life, and that is also kind of sad. But anyway, that is why there was no show last week, and I am not offering any apologies for it. Like I said, it was incredibly tough, and that's pretty much all I'm going to say about that. So, moving on. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Back on November 14th, there was a shooting at Saugus High School in Santa Clarita, California. Victims of the shooting were 14-year-old Dominic Blackwell, who died the following day, and 15-year-old Gracie Milberger. Now, we still, as far as I can tell, have no idea where he got the gun. He was 16, so however he got this gun, it was illegally obtained. Now, California has perhaps some of the toughest, most draconian gun laws in the country. Yet, this shooting still happened. I take this as proof that gun control simply doesn't work. This kid wanted to inflict harm, and he did. He found a gun, and he did. And to make things even more confusing, the gun that he used was not one of his parents' weapons. His dad was an avid hunter. He went hunting with his dad. His father passed away a couple of years ago, and we'll get into that in a second. But all of his dad's weapons were accounted for. The one that he used in this shooting was not one of them. But of course, immediately after the shooting, leftists were calling for more gun control, universal background checks, etc., etc., etc. But since he didn't buy this gun or obtain this gun legally, how would a background check have prevented this? None of the measures already in place in California prevented it. Nothing that has been proposed in the disarmament primary would have prevented it. So that begs the question, what is the solution? Now, this is going to be an unpopular opinion, but sometimes these things are simply not preventable. Now, the Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center report that we talked about in the last show suggests that most school shootings or most violence perpetrated in schools could have been prevented. Of the 41, I believe it was 41 incidents that they examined, all of them in their estimation could have been prevented. Once we get more details, maybe we will find out that a lot of the signs that they talked about in that report were exhibited by this kid and therefore could have been prevented. But like I said, sometimes these things are only obvious in hindsight, and sometimes there are no signs. Obviously, we need to do a better job at spotting them when they are there, but sometimes these things are just not preventable. Now, we don't know very many details about this shooter yet. He was described as a quiet kid, People who knew him were shocked that he could do something like this. But as I alluded to earlier, his father did pass away a couple of years ago, and he was the one that found his father's body. So obviously that had to have some lasting effect on him. And maybe he did show some signs that was an issue. Obviously it's going to be some sort of issue, but maybe he did show some signs that the way he was going to deal with this could be violent in nature. But law enforcement never had any interactions with him. They're still investigating. They're still digging, trying to find a motive. But he had a reputation for being responsible with firearms, like I said earlier. He went hunting with his father. He had a reputation for, like I said, being responsible with firearms, knowing how to use them. And his neighbors and his classmates have expressed shock that he would do something like this. So it's going to be interesting to see in the coming days, weeks, maybe months. And then after all that investigation, they could come up with absolutely nothing. In which case, as I said, sometimes these things are just not preventable. Evil, whether it's the result of an actual evil intent or some sort of mental defect, will find a way. And if he didn't end up with access to the firearm that he used, a hammer, a knife, it could have been anything. He just turned 16. Maybe he gets behind the wheel and plows through a crowd of kids at his school. You just don't know. But again, a lot of this is speculation. Let the investigation play out, see what happens, see what they turn up. As of now, though, this far removed and they still have no motive, that's a scary proposition. All right, moving on to another topic that I didn't get to talk about because there was no show last week. Roger Stone, who is a longtime Republican political operative / strategist and friend of Donald Trump, was convicted of witness tampering, lying to Congress, and obstruction of justice. Now, Roger Stone has a reputation in permanent Washington for being a not so nice fella. I've seen him described as a cockroach, loathsome, a political sleazeball, and a lot worse that I won't repeat here. Now, I haven't done a ton of research on Roger Stone. I've done some. He seemed small time in the grand scheme of the 2016 election and things of that nature. I know he had a big reputation back in the day. He was connected to Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan. So he's been a permanent fixture in the conservative movement for decades. But in the research I have done, the reputation that he's portrayed as having could very well be deserved. I don't know, but frankly, I don't care. It doesn't really matter. In January of this year, Stone was arrested at 30 when a federal SWAT team descended on his house with automatic weapons, armored vehicles, and a helicopter to drag this 66-year-old man and his hearing-impaired wife out of bed looking down the barrel of a rifle. Then, just to add to the indignity, CNN was alerted so they could broadcast his humiliation live. So again, whatever you think of Roger Stone, whatever his reputation, he is not a violent person. He hasn't been accused of any violent crimes. He hasn't been accused of anything other than being an asshole. So compare and contrast that with how an already convicted pedophile was treated. Jeffrey Epstein was convicted of recruiting dozens of girls, some as young as 13 years old, for sex at his mansion in Palm Beach, Florida. He reached a plea deal in 2007, which gave him immunity from federal prosecution in exchange for pleading guilty to lesser charges. He didn't plead, he didn't flip on some other bigwigs. He didn't flip on on an actual human trafficker or a big time human trafficker. He just pled guilty to some lesser charges. What is that? Then he served 13 months in county jail, not a federal or a state prison, which is where he clearly belonged. And on top of that, he got work release. So that meant he could spend most of his incarceration, quote unquote, in his Palm Beach office. Now, the latest charges accused Epstein of molesting as many as 34 underage girls. No federal SWAT team was dispatched to his house. Prosecutors called his lawyers and asked them to get him to turn himself in. And he did. Obviously, because in case we were wondering, Jeffrey Epstein did not kill himself. But how do you... Every time I think about this just baffles me. How is it that a convicted pedophile accused of dozens of additional molestations get asked to turn himself in? And yet Roger Stone, who is a law-abiding citizen, 66 years old, no threat to anyone, he gets swatted. Well, here's part of the difference. Roger Stone actually had the unmitigated gall to help Trump get elected, which warranted an armed incursion into his home. A convicted child diddler with connections to the Clintons and other extremely powerful people was allowed to turn himself in. One of these men is clearly dangerous and warranted a SWAT team, and the other one is a 66-year-old man with no history of violence whose only crime was lying to Congress and helping get public enemy number one elected to the presidency. And one of these men is facing the prospect of spending the rest of his life in jail. And the other one, while no longer with us, did not kill himself. But in what world does this chain of events make any sense? But I mean, this is actually emblematic of a much, much larger issue going on in our culture right now. And I'll tell you what I believe that is when we get back from this quick break. So a convicted child molester gets politely asked to turn himself in, while a guy convicted of lying to Congress is swatted. This is, as I said, emblematic of a much larger problem in our culture right now.
But I don't believe it was rape.
Roman Polanski didn't rape, according to Whoopi Goldberg, that little girl. Little girls are being told that they can get an abortion without their parents' knowledge or consent. Children are being allowed to make, not just allowed, encouraged to make body-altering, life-altering decisions about their gender, being allowed to dress in drag, dance at gay clubs where men throw money at them, drag queen story time where it's convicted sex offenders are allowed to be alone with children. Children are being exploited, marginalized, taken advantage of to the point where people accused of abusing them and parents who are clearly guilty of exploiting them are treated like it's no big deal, not a problem at all. And the longer this goes on, the worse it bodes for our future, because the children that we're allowing this to happen to today are going to be the ones that shape the culture in the future. And as it is right now, if this madness continues, we are in deep, deep trouble. All right, let's move on to some more recent issues that we need to deal with. ChickfilA, my favorite fast food restaurant, has disappointed us this week. They decided to cave and genuflect before the leftist rage mob. Now, this is a really, really bad idea. And I don't understand it. Chick-fil-A had the upper hand. They were holding all the cards. In terms of customer satisfaction, food quality, etc., they're the number one restaurant chain in America. Now, in terms of sales, according to the QSR 50, McDonald's is still number one, and they're out front by a lot. They're doing $37.5 billion in sales, while Chick-fil-A is at $9 billion. So it's going to be a long time before Chick-fil-A, or anyone really, catches them in terms of sales and real dollars. I suppose Starbucks could, because they're the closest and they have a comparable number of stores, but I don't really consider them in the same category. I mean, McDonald's has 14,000 stores. Starbucks has almost 14,000 stores. And Chick-fil-A is at 2,200. Now, if you extrapolate that out, Chick-fil-A is ahead of McDonald's. And I mean, I haven't eaten a burger from McDonald's in at least 15 years, and it's probably closer to 20. So again, Chick-fil-A, they're not going to overtake McDonald's in terms of sales. But this genuflection is not going to inspire leftists to start eating there. Although I suspect that a lot of the leftists who claim to boycott Chick-fil-A actually secretly eat there because it's the best tasting food, the best tasting fast food out there. I mean, let's be real. I mean, there are some others I do like Chipotle, but again, they're not in the same category as McDonald's or Chick-fil-A. But what this might do is drive some conservatives to stop eating there. I mean, I'm not one of these boycotters, and I would never tell anybody to participate in a boycott. But what's happening with Chick-fil-A is disappointing. But I mean, if I let everything that the left did influence my movie, TV, music, or dining choices, I'd be a recluse. I'd never watch anything but The Blaze and One American News Network, if I can get the app to work consistently, but that's another story. All right, we're gonna move on now to some impeachment stuff. There was a lot of sound to get through, and a lot of the questioning that went on was just ridiculous. And all it did was prove to the American people that what the left is doing is completely partisan, inappropriate, and without any merit whatsoever. The first example of this ridiculousness I want to get to is Eric Swalwell and his questioning of Marie Ivanovich.
Chris, so far, the evidence is uncontradicted that the president used taxpayer dollars to ask the Ukrainians to help him cheat an election.
Sorry about that. That was the wrong cut. That was Eric Swalwell actually making more sense than I've ever heard, frankly. But oh my goodness. Oh man, fart jokes never get old. Anyway, moving on. Actually, before we do, the explanation that was given was that the sound you heard was a coffee cup scraping across a table. Now, does anyone really believe that? If you watch the tape, listen to the audio, it is obvious that it's emanating from the smarter end of Eric Swalwell. Now, some people have said that Chris Matthews, who was conducting that interview, has a reputation for being gaseous. But if you look at the body language, the timing, everything tells me that was purely Eric Swalwell at his finest. Okay, so let's actually get into impeachment. There is so much stupid, farts notwithstanding, coming out of these hearings. The spin from the leftists in Congress and their media lapdogs, if all you listened to was that, you would swear that President Trump is a traitor and committed all manner of heinous acts. But what's coming out is what everyone who pays attention and not suffering from an acute case of Trump derangement syndrome already knew. This is a giant nothing burger. Russia hoax part deux. I mean, you had Ivanovich, Sunland, Hill, Kent, Taylor, Vindman, all saying basically President Trump did nothing wrong.
Did the president ever tell you personally about any preconditions for anything?
No.
Okay, so the president never told you about any preconditions for the aid to be released?
No.
The president never told you about any preconditions for a White House meeting?
Personally, no.
You said you didn't have your records or your documents from the State Department, but if you did, there wouldn't be any document or record that ties President Trump personally to any of this, correct?
Boy, I don't want to speculate what would be on...
Your documents or records.
I don't recall anything like
Okay.
that. No.
Now, I had people in my social media feed talking about how Sunland was going to sing like a bird. He doesn't know the tune. He just said he doesn't recall President Trump doing anything like that. I mean, according to CNN and MSDNC, this was supposed to be some bombshell testimony. Please.
Madam Ambassador, as you see it here before us, very simply and directly, do you have any information regarding the President of the United States accepting any bribes?
No.
Do you have any information regarding any criminal activity that the President of the United States has been involved with at all?
No.
So now it's bribery. I mean, they just can't make up their minds. First, it was collusion with Russia. Then it was obstruction of justice. Now it's bribery. I mean, come on.
The problem is, in an impeachment inquiry that the Speaker of the House says is all about bribery, where bribery is the impeachable offense, no witness has used the word bribery to describe President Trump's conduct. 6 weeks of witness interviews in this impeachment inquiry, hundreds of hours of testimony, thousands of questions asked, thousands of answers given. The number of times that witnesses have been asked any question about whether or not President Trump's conduct constituted bribery is zero. The number of times witnesses have used the word bribery or bribe to describe President Trump's conduct in the last 6 weeks of this inquiry is zero. In fact, in these 3,500 pages of sworn deposition testimony and just these 10 transcripts released thus far, the word bribery appears exactly one time. And ironically, it appears not in a description of President Trump's alleged conduct, it appears in a description of Vice President Biden's alleged conduct.
Isn't that a daisy?
Indeed, it is. I mean, they have been at this for 3 years. They've been at it since before he even took office. And yet, here we are 3 years later and nothing. It's like I always say this. The left is always going to accuse you of the things that they are guilty of doing. Now let's go back to Marie Ivanovich for a second. Listen to part of her opening statement.
And although I have met former Vice President Biden several times over the course of our many years in government service, neither he nor the previous administration ever raised the issue of either Burisma or Hunter Biden with me.
So she claims to be unfamiliar with Hunter Biden and his ties to Burisma. But is she telling the truth?
The first time you personally became aware of Burisma was actually when you were being prepared by the Obama State Department for your Senate confirmation hearings. And this was in the form of practice questions and answers. This was your deposition. And you testified that in this particular practice Q&A with the Obama State Department, it wasn't just generally about Burisma and corruption, it was specifically about Hunter Biden and Burisma. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And the exact quote from your testimony, Ambassador, is, quote, "The way the question was phrased in this model Q&A was, what can you tell us about Hunter Biden's, being named to the board of Burisma?" So for the millions of Americans watching, President Obama's own State Department was so concerned about potential conflicts of interest from Hunter Biden's role at Burisma that they raised it themselves while prepping this wonderful ambassador nominee before her confirmation. And yet our Democratic colleagues and the chairman of this committee cry foul when we dare ask that same question that the Obama State Department was so concerned about.
The answer is very clearly no. Now, before we take a break, there's just one last cut I want to get to, but this one is devastating. This is Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and part of his exchange with Devon Nunez.
Mr. Vindman, you testified in your deposition that you did not know the whistleblower.
Ranking member, it's Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, please.
Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, you testified in the deposition that you did not know who the whistleblower was or is.
I do not know who the whistleblower is. That is.
So how is it possible for you to name these people and then out the whistleblower?
Per the advice of my counsel, I've been advised not to answer specific questions about members of the intelligence community.
Did you hear his little stumble before he caught himself and went into the whole Fifth Amendment deal? Devon Nunez made an obvious but brilliant point right here, because how can they, like he said, if he doesn't know who the whistleblower is, how is it at all possible for him to out the whistleblower? It doesn't make any sense. So either A, he does know who the whistleblower is and he's lying, or B, he doesn't know who the whistleblower is and Adam Schiff is creating this entire ridiculous narrative for no reason. But of course, we know that the left, everything they do, whether it's a good reason or not, they do these things for a reason. All right, y'all, that segment went a lot longer than I wanted it to. I didn't want to spend that much time on the impeachment stuff because so many other people are doing really good investigative journalism on this issue. Talking about John Solomon and Malling Hemingway and Dan Bongino. They're all doing great stuff. I don't have the time or, frankly, the energy to spend on this topic, but I just felt like listening to all of those ridiculous testimonies, I just felt like I had to bring that to you and let you know exactly what is going on. But anyway, we're going to take another quick break, and when we get back, we're going to talk a little pop culture and get you out of here with some adventures of the galactically stupid. Okay, so it's been a while since I've done this. It's been quite some time, actually, but I'm going to geek out on you here for a little bit and talk about, well, we broke down and we signed up for Disney Plus. I know a lot of people are dead set against that. That's fine. I'm not letting a lot of leftist ridiculousness get in the way of what I want to use for my entertainment choices. So we got Disney Plus, and if you're so inclined, I highly recommend it because it's not just, I mean, they announced the content and it was supposed to be pretty limited in terms of what they were going to offer in the very beginning. But it is, if this is limited, when they finally get the entire library fleshed out, it's going to be insane. I mean, we're talking classic Disney from Lady and the Tramp, Dumbo, Lion King, Bambi, the Aristocats, The Little Mermaid, all that, Beauty and the Beast, all that stuff. And of course, as all you longtime listeners know, I am a huge Marvel fan. So all the Marvel content that's available, not all 23 movies or whatever it is, but a lot of them are there. I'm also a Star Wars fan. Not quite as much as a lot of people I know. I haven't read all the fan fiction and all the fan comic books. I don't know all the timelines and the history of the Jedi and the Sith and all that. I just enjoy the movies. But I was really looking forward to The Mandalorian, which is the first original property for Disney Plus. And that show launched when the service launched. It's really well done. The first episode, bit of a slow burn, but still enjoyable for me, and I'm sure for pretty much every Star Wars fan. The second episode was better. The third episode really kicked it up a notch. It was really, really good. So if you're a fan of Star Wars, I imagine you probably already signed up. If you're a fan of Marvel or Disney, they also have the National Geographic content, which I ended up watching the other night, the search for Alexander the Great's tomb. And people who know me know that I'm a really big fan of Greek culture, history, mythology. And so that was a really fascinating thing for me to watch. So, I mean, and with the Nat Geo, you have all the veterinary shows and all the animal shows and all the Earth shows. It's just, I highly recommend it. I didn't think I would recommend it I didn't think I would like it as much as I do, because the price was really low for people who sign up early. But it's well worth it. And it's going to jump up probably in the next year or so. And it's probably still going to be worth it because they're just going to keep adding content. So with what's on there now and the slate of all the Marvel shows and movies on the schedule, this is going to be a Comic-Con fanboy's dream. All right, y'all, I could go on and get really, really nerdy, but I'm just going to go ahead and get you out of here with this week's
The Adventures of the Galactically Stupid!
This week's winner, or loser, depending on your point of view, comes to us from Joe Rogan and his podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience. And back in the beginning of November, I believe it was November 7th or 8th, he had a guy on his podcast by the name of Pete Dominic. Oh my goodness, this dude is a moron.
Studying this idea that we argue about the Second Amendment, like, let's let constitutional lawyers, I think, discuss a lot of those things, and we should all understand that and be curious about it. But our Constitution is also silly. Like, let's remake everything. Have a serious conversation about what kind of guns and bullets people can have. Not that they can have them or that they can't have. Like, that's the conversation. That's where we should be right now. Everything gets regulated. Everything. I don't know. I don't think that there's much past the conversation about accessibility to guns that can fire that many rounds that quickly, killing that many people. I don't think we have to get rid of those somehow. I think you buy as many as you can back for sure. You spend a whole bunch of taxpayer money. Just help. By the way, there's a ton of people in a bind right now that have a rifle, but like, oh my God, I'm not gonna be able to afford my insulin. Let me get rid of this AK-47 to live another month. You buy some guns back, it's a good expenditure of money, and then melt them down. Well, the Second Amendment has been interpreted wrong by the Supreme Court, in my opinion. I mean, it doesn't say that people should have, until 2008, it didn't say that. Nobody thought that people should have a personal right to guns till the Heller case. Because people can have guns. You can have guns. Everybody has a right to have guns. You just can't have these guns anymore. No more of those ones. You can have all these guns. You sell fear. Like, home invasion is any family's worst fear. But it doesn't happen very much.
There's something to that, but there's also something to the reason why we have so many cars. People like them.
I'll have that conversation. We should get rid of all the cars.
Okay.
Well, I mean, we're not. Don't get me wrong.
That's ridiculous. Why should we get rid of all the cars? Do you not like freedom?
I listen to that and I don't even, a lot of that was edited. That took place over, I believe it was like an hour, 57 minutes to 2 hours and 12 minutes or something like that. That whole section where they talked about that subject. I edited a lot of what you heard from that. So I encourage you to go look that up on YouTube, the Joe Rogan Experience, episode 1380, Pete Dominic. From an hour and 58 minutes to 2 hours and 10 minutes, 12 minutes, something like that. So you can hear all of the ridiculousness in context. Not that there's a whole lot of context missing, because it's just so mind-numbingly stupid. And Joe Rogan, he's not a rabid far leftist. He's left of center, to be sure, but he can be reasoned with. And he tried to reason with this guy, as you heard. Do you not like freedom? That was a good line. But I'm actually going to take that section, that entire section, and break it down on an episode of this podcast, because there is so much to unpack that I can't just leave it at in this apocalyptically stupid section of the show, because there's a lot to unpack and a lot to debunk and a lot to educate this fool about. I mean, it's just, And Joe Rogan needs an education too, because he talks about the Second Amendment and when it was written, and he doesn't know, and he's talking about how the founders couldn't possibly know what was going to happen. I've talked before on this show about the founders and their vision and what they were thinking when they wrote the Constitution and when they wrote the Second Amendment. And they did know. They could see what was coming. If you read a lot of their writings, if you read a lot of the debates they had, a lot of their writings and speeches fit right in with what's happening today. But, oh my goodness, just, I'm speechless. So we'll just call it and leave it there. So folks, thank you all for listening. Check us out on Spreaker, Spotify, SoundCloud, iTunes, iHeartRadio. Anywhere you get your podcast from, check us out, subscribe, leave a review, let us know what you think. You can also find us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Parlay. It's at The Liberty Cast on all 4 of those platforms. And check us out on the website, thelibertycast.net. Go to the podcast page. You'll find all the podcasts going back almost all the way to the beginning. And along with the podcast, you'll find links to a lot of the stories that I think you'll find interesting, that I think you'll help you understand what we were talking about during the show. So check it out. But again, thank you all for listening. I really appreciate it. And until next time, keep your head on a swivel and stay safe, everybody.